Sell the shop, or there won't be a shop left to sell. Those were the last words the men said before they walked out of Emma Carter's garage, leaving twisted metal and shattered glass behind them. She stood in the wreckage of everything her father built, and she had no idea that an old man quietly drinking his coffee in the corner had just decided her fight was now his fight too. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, follow along to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Emma Carter had been awake since 4 in the morning, and by the time the sun came up over the hills outside of Millers Creek, Montana, she had already changed the oil on 2 trucks, replaced a starter motor, and argued with a parts supplier who wanted payment up front before shipping anything else to her account. She was 28 years old. She had grease permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles, and she had inherited a business that was slowly killing her. Though she would never have said it that way out loud, not to her employees, not to her customers, and certainly not to herself, not on the days when giving up felt like the only reasonable option left. The shop had been her father's, Carter's Auto and Diesel Repair. The sign still read faded red letters on white metal, hanging slightly crooked since a windstorm 2 winters back that nobody had gotten around to fixing. Her father, Walt Carter, built that business from nothing over 31 years. One satisfied customer at a time, one fair price at a time. One Sunday spent teaching some kid down the road how to change his own brake pads because Walt believed a man should know how to take care of his own truck. Emma had grown up under that roof, literally and figuratively sweeping floors before she was tall enough to see over the workbench, handing her father wrenches before she knew the names of half of them. Her mother passed first cancer when Emma was 22, and her father followed less than 3 years later, his heart giving out on a Tuesday afternoon while he was under a Ford pickup that still sat in the back bay, half finished, because Emma hadn't been able to bring herself to touch it yet. Grief did strange things to a person. It made some people run from the past. It made Emma bury herself in it, working 70-hour weeks in the same building where she'd lost her father, because somehow keeping the shop open felt like the only way to keep him alive. "You look like hell, boss," said Danny Ruiz, wiping his hands on a rag as Emma walked past him toward the office that morning. Danny had worked for her father for 9 years and had stayed on after Walt died out of something between loyalty and stubbornness. He was maybe 35, built like a linebacker, gone soft in the middle, and he was the closest thing Emma had to family left in that town. "Thanks, Danny. Real morale booster," Emma said, not stopping. "I'm serious. When's the last time you slept a full night?" "I sleep fine. You sleep in that chair in the office. I've seen you." Emma didn't answer that one because it was true, and there wasn't a good response to the truth. She pushed through the office door and sat down at the desk that still had her father's coffee mug sitting on the corner, a chipped thing that said "World's Okayest Mechanic" that she'd bought him as a joke when she was 16. She never washed it. She never used it either. It just sat there, a small monument nobody talked about. The mail on the desk told a story her exhaustion couldn't hide. Past due notices, a letter from the bank about her loan, the one she'd taken out 18 months ago to replace the hydraulic lift after the old one finally gave out, the one that was now 3 payments behind because a slow month in February had turned into a catastrophic month in March. Emma picked up the phone and dialed the bank before she lost her nerve. "First Montana Trust, this is Karen speaking." "Hi, Karen, it's Emma Carter again, calling about the loan on the account ending in..." "I know who you are, Emma." Karen's voice had the practiced patience of someone who'd had this exact conversation many times before. "I already told you last week there's nothing more I can do on my end. You're 3 payments behind. If you can't bring it current by the end of the month, this goes to collections, and from there, it's out of my hands entirely. I just need a little more time. Business always picks up in spring, you know that every year it's..." "Emma." Karen's tone softened just slightly, which somehow made it worse. "I like you. Your father was a good man, and I know you're doing everything you can. But I don't make the rules here. The end of the month. That's not a threat, that's just where things stand." Emma hung up the phone and sat there for a moment, with her hands still resting on the receiver, staring at nothing. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to come up with $11,000, or the bank would start proceedings that could eventually take the shop, take the land, take the last physical piece of her parents that still existed in this world. She wasn't going to cry. She promised herself that a long time ago, somewhere around the 2nd week after her father's funeral, when she realized that crying didn't fix engines, and it didn't fix bank accounts either. She stood up, splashed water on her face in the small bathroom off the office, and walked back out onto the shop floor like nothing was wrong at all. That was the moment Victor Hale's black Cadillac Escalade pulled into her lot. Emma had seen the vehicle before twice now over the past month, and both times it had brought the same man with it, a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive charcoal suit that looked deeply out of place against the backdrop of a small-town repair shop. He stepped out of the car with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life worried about money, and he smiled at Emma the way a wolf might smile at something smaller and slower. "Ms. Carter," Victor Hale said, extending a hand she didn't take. "I was hoping we could talk again." "I already gave you my answer, Mr. Hale. Twice. Circumstances change." He glanced around the shop at the peeling paint, at the outdated equipment, at everything Emma worked so hard every single day to keep functioning. "I understand you're behind on your loan payments. That's public record now, unfortunately, once these things go to collections. It tends to get around a small town like this." Emma felt her spine stiffen. "How do you know about my loan?" "I have people who pay attention to these things." Victor's smile never wavered. "Look, I'm not your enemy here, Emma. I'm offering you a way out. $400,000 for this property cash closing in 30 days. That's more than enough to pay off your debts, walk away clean, start fresh somewhere without all of this weight on your shoulders. This land is worth something to my development, but it isn't worth anything to you anymore except pain. I think you know that. This shop was my father's life's work. And your father is gone," Victor said gently, almost kindly, which somehow made the words crueler than if he'd shouted them. "Sentiment doesn't pay bank loans, Ms. Carter. I'd hate to see you lose everything for nothing when I'm sitting right here offering you a graceful exit." Emma stood absolutely still, her jaw tight, her hands curling into fists at her sides, where Victor couldn't see them from the angle he was standing. Every rational part of her brain understood the math. $400,000 would erase every debt she carried and leave her with enough to start over somewhere new, somewhere that didn't remind her every single morning of everything she'd lost. But there was another part of her, louder than the rational part, that remembered her father's hands guiding hers on a torque wrench when she was 9 years old. That remembered her mother bringing sandwiches out to the shop on hot summer days. That remembered every single person in this town who had ever needed a fair mechanic and found one here at prices that never gouged from a man who believed a business existed to serve people, not just profit off them. "No," Emma said. Victor's smile finally faltered just slightly, just enough for Emma to see something colder underneath it. "You're certain? I've told you no twice already. This makes 3. I'm not selling my father's shop, Mr. Hale. Not to you, not to anyone. Now, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property." For a long moment, Victor Hale simply looked at her, and something in his expression shifted from mild irritation to something far more calculating, something that made the hair on the back of Emma's neck stand up, even though she couldn't have said exactly why. "That's disappointing," he said finally, his voice quiet now, almost soft. "I really did want this to be easy for you, Emma. I hope you don't come to regret making it difficult." He got back into his Escalade without another word and pulled out of the lot gravel, crunching under expensive tires, and Emma stood there watching him go, with a knot of dread tightening in her stomach that she couldn't fully explain. Not yet, not until 3 days later, when everything in her life would change forever. Danny walked up beside her, wiping grease from his hands. "That guy again. That guy again. You told him no." "I told him no." Danny let out a low whistle. "Boss, I don't like the way that man looks at you, like he's already decided how this ends, and he's just waiting for the rest of us to catch up." Emma didn't say anything to that because deep down some part of her felt exactly the same way, and she didn't want to give that feeling any more power by putting it into words. The next 3 days passed in the ordinary rhythm of a struggling small business. Customers coming and going, invoices piling up Emma, working until her hands ached and her eyes burned from exhaustion. But underneath the ordinary rhythm, something had shifted. 2 of her regular customers canceled appointments without explanation. A parts supplier she'd worked with for 6 years suddenly claimed her account had been flagged for irregularities and refused to process a routine order. When Emma called to ask what irregularities they meant, nobody could give her a straight answer. Then on Thursday afternoon, an elderly man walked into the waiting area of Carter's Auto and Diesel Repair and asked quietly if he could sit and have a cup of coffee while he waited for a friend. Emma barely looked up from the invoice she was reviewing. Sure, coffee's on the counter. Help yourself. The man was probably in his 70s with a full head of white hair, pulled back neatly, weathered skin that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors, and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in far more than they let on. He wore a plain flannel shirt and worn jeans. Nothing remarkable about him at all, except for the way he moved quiet and deliberate like a man who had spent decades learning to be aware of every exit in every room he entered. He poured himself coffee, sat down in one of the plastic waiting room chairs, and said nothing else. Emma forgot about him almost immediately, absorbed in her own mounting problems, and that was exactly how he seemed to prefer it. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon when 3 men walked into the shop. Emma noticed them immediately because they didn't move like customers. Customers walked in tentatively, usually looking around for someone to help them, sometimes glancing nervously at price boards. These 3 men walked in like they owned the place, already spreading out across the shop floor, with the casual confidence of men who had done this exact thing before many times in many other places. Can I help you, gentlemen? Emma asked, stepping out from behind the counter. The largest of the 3, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a neck tattoo peeking above his collar, smiled at her without any warmth in it at all. We're here on behalf of Hale Development. Mr. Hale wanted us to make sure you fully understood his offer. I understand his offer perfectly. I already told him no. See, that's the thing. The man walked further into the shop, running his fingers along the edge of a workbench, deliberately like he was inspecting merchandise he intended to purchase. Mr. Hale doesn't like hearing no. He asked us to help you reconsider. Emma felt cold dread pooling in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. I'm going to need you to leave. We will, the man said, just as soon as we finish helping you reconsider. What happened next unfolded so fast that Emma would spend weeks afterward trying to piece the exact sequence back together in her memory. One of the men grabbed the hydraulic lift control panel, the same one Emma had gone into debt to install, and slammed it against the concrete floor until the housing cracked open and sparks hissed from the exposed wiring. Another man swept an entire shelf of specialty tools onto the ground, tools that had taken her father years to accumulate, tools with irreplaceable, sentimental value that Emma had never once considered selling, even during her worst months. Stop, Emma screamed, lunging forward, and the broad-shouldered man caught her by the shoulder, not violently, but with enough force to make it absolutely clear that resistance would not be tolerated. You don't want to get hurt over some old wrenches, sweetheart. Danny came running from the back bay, took one look at what was happening, and froze in the doorway, clearly calculating the odds of 3 armed-looking strangers against himself and realizing they weren't good odds at all. Call the police, Emma said to him, her voice shaking despite every effort to keep it steady. Go ahead, the broad-shouldered man said, releasing Emma's shoulder and stepping back with a shrug. By the time they get out here, we'll already be gone, and there won't be anything left for them to write up except a very expensive insurance claim. Assuming your insurance is even current. He said that last part with a small knowing smile, and Emma's stomach dropped because she knew exactly what he was implying. Her insurance premium had been one of the bills she'd let lapse 2 months ago when the choice came down to insurance or payroll, and she'd chosen to keep Danny and her other employee paid. The 3 men continued their systematic destruction for another 4 minutes, though it felt to Emma like it lasted an hour. They didn't touch the customer vehicles she noticed later in a small sick mercy that felt deliberate rather than accidental. They destroyed only her equipment, her father's equipment, the tools and machines that represented 3 decades of a man's honest work reduced to scrap metal and torn wiring in the space of a few violent minutes. Before they left, the broad-shouldered man turned back to face Emma, who stood frozen in the middle of the wreckage, tears finally breaking through despite every promise she'd made herself never to let them. Sell, he said, or next time there won't be a workshop left to save. They walked out, climbed into a black pickup truck, and disappeared down the road, leaving Emma standing alone amid the ruins of everything her father had built. Except she wasn't alone. The elderly man in the flannel shirt was still sitting in the waiting room chair, exactly where he'd been sitting for the past 40 minutes, his coffee cup still in his weathered hands, having watched the entire event unfold without saying a single word or moving a single muscle. Emma stared at him, something between confusion and desperate hope flickering across her face. You saw all of that. You saw what they did. The old man set his coffee cup down slowly on the small table beside him. I did. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you call for help? Or Emma's voice cracked, exhaustion and grief and fear, finally overwhelming her composure all at once. They destroyed everything. My father's tools, equipment I'm still paying off, and you just sat there. Yes, the old man said without a trace of apology in his voice, which somehow made Emma angrier rather than less so. I did. Do you have any idea what you just watched happen? Do you understand what those men just cost me? The old man rose slowly from his chair, joints stiff with age, and Emma noticed for the first time the faded outline of a tattoo peeking from beneath his rolled shirt sleeve, something old and half obscured by decades of sun damage, impossible to make out clearly. He walked toward the door without hurrying, and for a moment Emma thought he was simply going to leave, just like everyone else in her life lately seemed determined to do. Instead, he paused at the threshold and turned back to look at her, his pale blue eyes steady and unreadable. I'll see you next Wednesday, he said. Then he walked out into the afternoon light and got into an old pickup truck parked at the edge of the lot and drove away without another word, leaving Emma standing in the wreckage of her father's shop with absolutely no idea what those 5 words meant or why they made the dread in her chest feel somehow very slightly lighter. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know that the faded tattoo on his forearm was the ghost of a patch he'd worn with pride for over 4 decades. She didn't know that he had in fact seen everything, understood everything, and had already begun making calculations in his mind about exactly what needed to happen next. She had no idea that the quiet old man drinking coffee in her waiting room had once ridden with the Hells Angels, and that the code he'd lived by for 50 years had never once included the words, walk away. Emma spent that evening alone in the wreckage, cataloging the damage with shaking hands, taking photographs for an insurance claim she suspected would go nowhere given her lapsed coverage, and trying to calculate numbers that refused to make sense no matter how many times she ran them. The hydraulic lift alone would cost close to $9,000 to replace. The specialty tools, many of them irreplaceable antiques her father had collected over 3 decades, represented value that couldn't even be calculated in dollars. Danny stayed late with her sweeping broken glass into a dustpan, not saying much because there wasn't much to say. Around 9 that evening, he finally set down the broom and looked at her directly. Boss, I have to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer. Go ahead. Are you safe here? Because what happened today wasn't a robbery. Those men didn't take anything. They came here specifically to send a message, and I think you and I both know exactly who sent them. Emma didn't answer immediately because the honest answer terrified her too much to say out loud. Instead, she looked around at the destruction surrounding them, at the hydraulic lift lying in pieces, at the scattered tools that would need to be sorted through to determine what could still be salvaged, and she felt something inside her that had been bending under pressure for months finally begin to crack. I don't know, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'm safe. I don't know if I can keep this place open. I don't know anything right now, Danny, except that my father spent 31 years building something, and I am not going to be the one who lets it get taken away by a man in an expensive suit and the thugs he hired to do his dirty work. Danny nodded slowly, respect and worry mixing on his face in equal measure. Okay, then we figure this out together, but Emma, if things get worse, if those men come back... They said next time there wouldn't be a workshop left to save, Emma said quietly, repeating the exact words that had been echoing through her mind for hours. I don't think this is over, Danny. I think this was just a warning. She was right, though neither of them could have known just how right or how much would change over the following days in ways neither of them could possibly have predicted. That night, alone in the small apartment above the shop where she'd lived since her father passed, Emma sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad trying to make numbers work that simply refused to cooperate no matter how she arranged them. Insurance wouldn't cover the damage, not with her lapsed policy. The bank wanted $11,000 within 3 weeks, or foreclosure proceedings would begin. Now she was facing thousands more in equipment replacement costs on top of everything else, with a predator circling who had already demonstrated exactly how far he was willing to go to force her hand. She thought about Victor Hale's offer, $400,000, enough to erase every debt, walk away clean, maybe even start over somewhere far from Montana, somewhere that didn't remind her every single day of everything and everyone she'd lost. For the first time since her father died, Emma Carter genuinely considered giving up. She sat with that thought for a long time, turning it over in her mind, testing how it felt. And what she discovered, sitting alone in that small apartment at nearly midnight, surrounded by the silence of a building that used to be full of her father's laughter and her mother's humming while she brought out sandwiches for the crew, was that giving up felt like a second death, like losing her parents all over again, except this time by her own choice. No, Emma said out loud to the empty room, surprising herself with the sudden fierce certainty in her own voice. No, I'm not doing that. I don't care what it costs me. I am not selling my father's life's work to the man who just tried to terrify me into it. She didn't sleep much that night, but when the sun came up the next morning, she was already back downstairs sorting through the wreckage, determined to salvage whatever tools she could and figure out a plan for the rest, because that was what her father would have done, and because some stubborn, unbreakable part of her simply refused to let this be the end of the story. She had no idea that 400 miles away in a modest house on the edge of a different small town, an old man named Jack Callahan was sitting at his own kitchen table with his own legal pad, making a very different list. Names, phone numbers, people he hadn't spoken to in years, some of them in over a decade, men and women scattered across 4 Western states who had one thing in common. They had all at some point in their lives made Jack Callahan a promise. And Jack Callahan was a man who believed with his entire soul that promises existed to be kept, especially the ones made decades ago, especially when someone finally needed them called in. The following Monday, 2 more of Emma's suppliers suddenly discovered irregularities with her account. A regional trucking company that had been sending her their fleet maintenance for the past 4 years abruptly canceled their contract, citing logistical restructuring in a form email that reeked of a lie even a child could have seen through. Emma called the trucking company's dispatcher, directly a man named Roger she'd known for years, someone who'd always been friendly and straightforward with her. Roger, what's actually going on? You've sent us your fleet work since before my father passed. There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the line before Roger finally answered, his voice low, almost apologetic. Emma, I like you and I liked your dad, but I got a call last week. Somebody made it real clear that if we kept doing business with your shop, our permits for the new distribution route might run into some unexpected delays at the county level. I've got 40 employees depending on that route, Emma. I can't risk it. I'm sorry. I truly am. Emma hung up the phone with her hands trembling, understanding now with terrifying clarity exactly how thoroughly Victor Hale intended to isolate her. This wasn't just about breaking equipment. This was about strangling her business, slowly cutting off every artery of income and support until she had no choice left but to sell or watch everything collapse around her, regardless. By Wednesday, exactly 1 week after the attack on her shop, Emma was sitting behind the counter, reviewing yet another rejection letter. This one from a second bank she'd approached about refinancing, when the bell above the door chimed and the old man from the previous week walked back in exactly as he'd promised he would. He wore the same weathered flannel, the same quiet, deliberate way of moving, and he sat down in the same chair he'd occupied the week before, as though the past 7 days had simply folded themselves in half and deposited him right back where he'd started. You came back, Emma said, unable to keep a small note of surprise from her voice. Told you I would. You did. Emma studied him for a long moment, taking in details she'd been too shocked and exhausted to notice the previous week. The faded outline of that old tattoo, the way his eyes moved constantly around the room, cataloging exits and entrances with an awareness that seemed almost military in its precision. Can I ask you something? You can ask. Who are you? And why did you come back after watching what happened last week and doing absolutely nothing to stop it? The old man was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same unhurried patience he seemed to bring to everything. Name's Jack Callahan, he finally said, and I didn't do nothing last week, Emma. I want to be very clear about that. I did exactly what needed doing at that moment, which was watch, remember, and wait. Wait for what? For the right time to start moving. Emma felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cold March air outside. Moving how? Jack Callahan looked at her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes steady and unblinking, and something in his expression carried the weight of decades of promises kept and debts remembered, of a code that had guided his entire life long before Emma Carter had even been born. Your father, Jack said quietly, fixed my truck for free once 22 years ago when I had nowhere else to turn and no money to pay for it. He didn't know me from anyone, Didn't ask questions about why a man like me needed help in the middle of the night on a stretch of Montana highway with nothing around for 50 miles. He just fixed it, sent me on my way, and told me the debt was paid the moment I helped somebody else who needed it someday. Emma's breath caught in her throat. I don't remember that. I don't remember you at all. You wouldn't. You were maybe 6 years old asleep in the house while your daddy worked on my rig in the dark. But I remembered. I've remembered every single day since, and I've been waiting 22 years for the moment I could finally pay that debt back the way your father would have wanted. And you think this is that moment, watching men destroy my shop? I think, Jack said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping lower, more intense, that a man named Victor Hale badly underestimated exactly what he was starting when he decided to come after Walt Carter's daughter. And I think by the time this is over, he's going to understand precisely how big a mistake that was. Emma stared at him, her heart pounding, uncertain whether to feel terrified or something entirely different, something that felt dangerously close to hope after a week that had offered her none. Mr. Callahan, I don't even know what that means. It means, Jack said, standing slowly, joints creaking with age, but his voice carrying an unmistakable steel underneath the weathered exterior, that you should keep these doors open, Emma, no matter what happens over the next few weeks, no matter how bad it looks. You keep these doors open and you let me worry about the rest. He turned to leave and Emma called after him, desperation cracking through her voice. Wait, please. Who are you really? What are you planning to do? Jack paused at the door, glancing back at her over his shoulder. And for just a moment, something flickered across his weathered face that looked almost like a smile, though it carried none of the warmth that word usually implied. It was the expression of a man remembering exactly who he used to be and discovering that person hadn't gone anywhere at all, merely gone quiet for a while. Let's just say, Jack Callahan said, that I used to ride with some people. People who take it very seriously when somebody threatens a good man's daughter over a piece of land. He walked out the door before Emma could ask another question, climbing into his old pickup truck and pulling out onto the highway, leaving Emma standing behind her counter with her heart hammering and 1,000 new questions crowding into the space where her fear had been living for the past week. She didn't know it yet, but 300 miles away in a garage belonging to a retired diesel mechanic named Frank Duvall, a phone was ringing and Frank was about to hear a voice he hadn't heard in 11 years say 4 words that would change the trajectory of everything happening in Millers Creek, Montana. Jack, it's time, the voice on the other end said once Frank picked up. I need you. And 400 miles in the other direction, in a small apartment above a bar in Billings, a former Army mechanic named Rosa Delgado was staring at her phone in stunned silence, listening to the same voice explain the same situation, feeling something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose she'd almost forgotten existed. Neither of them hesitated for more than a few seconds before agreeing. Back in Millers Creek, Emma spent the rest of that Wednesday in a strange state of suspended tension, half expecting Victor Hale's men to return at any moment, half consumed by curiosity about the mysterious old man who claimed a 22-year-old debt gave him reason to fight a battle that wasn't his own. She didn't sleep well that night either, though for entirely different reasons than the sleepless nights before. Thursday brought bad news stacked on top of worse news. Her business insurance company, upon finally reviewing her claim, denied it outright, citing the lapse policy exactly as Emma had feared. The specialty tool distributor she'd used for 15 years inherited relationship and all informed her via curt email that her account had been closed due to risk assessment concerns. When Emma called to ask what that meant, the representative on the line couldn't or wouldn't explain further, simply repeating corporate language that told her absolutely nothing except that someone somewhere was pulling strings far above her ability to see or fight against. By Friday afternoon, Emma sat behind her counter staring at numbers that had gone from merely terrible to genuinely catastrophic, and for the second time in a week, she found herself seriously questioning whether continuing this fight made any rational sense at all. That was when Danny came rushing in from the back bay, his phone in his hand, an expression on his face that Emma couldn't immediately identify. Boss, you need to see this. See what? Just come look. Emma followed him out into the parking lot, and what she saw there made her stop completely still, her breath catching in her throat, disbelief and something like wonder washing over her all at once. Parked across the width of her lot, engines idling in low rumbling unison, were 11 motorcycles, their riders standing beside them in a loose but deliberate formation. Most of them were older gray-haired men, and a few women weathered by decades of sun and wind and hard living, wearing plain leather vests without club colors, without patches, without any obvious markers of affiliation at all, and standing at the center of them, arms crossed, watching Emma with an expression of quiet satisfaction, was Jack Callahan. "Mr. Callahan," Emma said slowly, walking toward him with Danny close behind her. "What is this?" "This," Jack said, gesturing to the group behind him, "is Frank. That's Rosa. Behind her, Miguel and his brother Tommy, both of them diesel mechanics for going on 30 years combined. The rest of them you'll meet soon enough. They came because I called, and they came because your father earned something a long time ago that none of them ever forgot." Emma looked at the group, at the weathered faces and steady eyes, at people she'd never met, who had apparently driven hundreds of miles based on nothing more than a phone call from a man they clearly trusted with their entire lives. "I don't understand," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion she could barely control. "Why would any of you do this? You don't even know me." A woman near the front of the group, silver hair pulled back in a tight braid, deep laugh lines etched around eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward. "We know your father," Rosa said simply. "That's enough. That's always been enough for people like us." Emma felt tears threatening again, and this time she didn't fight them quite as hard. "I can't ask you all to do this. I can't ask you to get involved in something that has nothing to do with you." Jack Callahan stepped forward, his expression softening slightly, though the steel underneath never fully disappeared. "You're not asking Emma. That's exactly the point. Nobody's asking permission here. We're simply doing what needed doing a long time before you ever knew we existed." Behind them, Frank Duval, a stocky man with forearms like tree trunks and a gray beard trimmed neat and close, was already pulling tools from the back of his truck, examining the wreckage of Emma's hydraulic lift, with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent his entire life fixing things other people considered broken beyond repair. "This lift's salvageable," Frank called out. "Give me 2 days and the right parts, I'll have it running better than it did before those idiots touched it." "I don't have money to pay for parts," Emma said quietly, shame coloring her voice even as gratitude threatened to overwhelm her. "Didn't ask you for money," Frank said, not even looking up from his examination of the damaged wiring. "Ask you for coffee, maybe. Parts I can source myself. Got a supplier down in Butte who owes me a favor going back longer than you've probably been alive." Emma stood in her own parking lot, surrounded by strangers who had somehow impossibly become allies in the space of a single afternoon, and for the first time in over a week, the crushing weight on her chest lifted just slightly, just enough to let her breathe a little easier. But even as hope began flickering back to life inside her, Jack Callahan's expression carried a warning that Emma couldn't ignore, a seriousness that told her this fight was far from over, and that whatever was coming next would test everything and everyone standing in that parking lot. "Emma," Jack said quietly, pulling her slightly aside from the others, his voice dropping to something meant only for her. "I need you to understand something important. Victor Hale isn't going to stop just because he sees a few motorcycles in your parking lot. Men like him don't scare that easily, not on the surface. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. He's going to escalate. He's going to come at you from angles you haven't even considered yet. Then why help me at all if you already know it's going to get worse?" Jack looked at her steadily, and for just a moment the weight of decades seemed to settle visibly on his weathered shoulders, the memory of promises made and battles fought long before Emma Carter had been born. "Because," he said quietly, "some things are worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Your father understood that better than almost anyone I ever knew. And because men like Victor Hale," Jack continued, his voice hardening into something Emma hadn't heard from him yet, something that carried the unmistakable echo of a man who had faced down far worse threats in his lifetime and walked away standing, "have survived this long only because good people kept quietly stepping aside instead of standing together. That ends now, Emma. Starting today in this parking lot, that ends." Emma looked out at the small gathering of strangers who had become allies within the space of a single afternoon at Franco already, elbow deep in her broken hydraulic lift at Rosa, organizing salvage tools with brisk efficiency at faces weathered by decades of hard living and harder choices, all of them standing here because of a debt one old man remembered and refused to let go unpaid. She had absolutely no idea, standing there in the fading afternoon light, that this was only the very beginning. She had no idea how far Victor Hale was willing to go, how much worse things would get before they got better, or how completely her entire understanding of loyalty, family, and what people were capable of when they refused to walk away from each other was about to be turned upside down. All she knew in that single suspended moment was that for the first time in over a week, she didn't feel quite so alone anymore. And somewhere across town in an office on the top floor of the tallest building Miller's Creek possessed, Victor Hale stood at his window, watching a small crowd of motorcycles gather in the distance, outside Carter's auto and diesel repair, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something considerably darker as understanding slowly dawned on him. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't needed to use in quite some time. "We have a problem," he said when the call connected, "and I think it's time we stop playing nice." Victor Hale set the phone down and remained standing at the window for a long moment, watching the small crowd of motorcycles below, with an expression that had hardened into something calculating and cold. The man on the other end of that call, a fixer named Preston Cole, who handled the parts of Victor's business that never appeared on any official ledger, hadn't said much beyond acknowledging the order. Preston never said much. That was exactly why Victor kept him on retainer. "They think a handful of old bikers changes anything," Victor murmured to himself, turning away from the window. "They have no idea what they've started." Down at the shop, Jack Callahan had already begun organizing the small crew with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to command, though he never raised his voice and never issued anything that sounded remotely like an order. He simply suggested, and somehow everyone around him understood exactly what needed doing. "Frank, you and Miguel take the hydraulic lift," Jack said. "Rosa, I want you cataloging every tool that's salvageable versus what needs replacing. Tommy, check the electrical panel those men tore into. If they left anything live and exposed, I want it dead before anyone else touches it." Emma watched all of this unfold with something between awe and disbelief, standing near the counter with Danny beside her, both of them witnessing a transformation in real time. What had been a devastated, half-abandoned shop just hours earlier was now humming with purposeful activity, strangers moving with practiced coordination like they'd worked together for years instead of minutes. "They don't even know each other that well, do they?" Emma asked quietly. "Some of them do," Jack said, overhearing her. "Some of them met for the first time an hour ago. Doesn't matter. When you've lived the life we've lived, you learn how to fall into rhythm fast. It's survival." "What life is that exactly?" Emma pressed. "You still haven't really told me." Jack's eyes flickered toward her, something unreadable passing behind them. "Some other time, Emma. Right now we've got work to do." By early evening, Frank had the hydraulic lifts housing reassembled, waiting on replacement hoses that Rosa had already tracked down through a contact 3 counties over. Miguel had rewired the damaged control panel entirely from scratch, testing it twice before declaring it safe. The shop, which had looked like a war zone that morning, was beginning to resemble something functional again, piece by piece, hour by hour. Danny pulled Emmy aside near the office door, his voice low. "Boss, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." "Okay. Do you trust these people?" "Really trust them, because I like what I'm seeing here, don't get me wrong, but we don't know anything about them. We don't know what Jack Callahan actually did all those years riding with whoever he rode with. We don't know if getting involved with people like this makes things better or worse." Emma considered the question seriously, watching Rosa laugh at something Frank said, while she wired a replacement fluorescent light back into its socket. "I don't know for certain, Danny, but I know what those 3 men did to this shop a week ago. I know Victor Hale sent them. And right now, these strangers are the only people in this entire town willing to stand next to me instead of quietly stepping back and letting me drown." Danny nodded slowly, though worry still lingered behind his eyes. "Just be careful, that's all I'm asking." "I will." She wouldn't be a not entirely, though neither of them could have known that yet. Around 7 that evening, as the crew began wrapping up for the night, a delivery truck pulled into the lot unmarked, unscheduled, unexpected. Emma tensed immediately at memories of the previous week's attack flooding back, but Jack simply raised a hand, calm and unbothered. "That's mine," he said. "Ordered it this afternoon." The driver unloaded several large crates, and when Frank pried one open, Emma's breath caught. Inside sat a brand new diagnostic computer system, the exact model she'd been coveting for over a year, but could never justify the $11,000 price tag against her shrinking budget. "Jack, I can't accept this. I can't even come close to affording this." "Didn't ask you to afford it," Jack said simply, already moving to help Frank lift the crate. Consider it overdue interest on a 22-year-old debt. This is too much. This is Emma. Jack's voice carried a firmness that stopped her mid-sentence. Let people help you. That's not weakness. Your father let me help him plenty over the years, in small ways he probably never told you about. It's how good people survive in this world. You take help when it's offered honestly, and you offer it back when someone else needs it. That's the whole deal. That's all it's ever been. Emma didn't have a response to that, not one that wouldn't have broken her composure entirely, so she simply nodded and turned back to work. Blinking hard against tears, she refused to let fall in front of everyone. The crew finally dispersed around 9 that night, promising to return the following morning, and Jack lingered behind after the others had gone, standing near his truck in the darkened parking lot, while Emma locked up the front office. Jack, Emma called out before he could climb into his truck. Can I ask you something serious? Go ahead. Victor Hale isn't going to just accept losing today. You said so yourself. What happens next? What am I actually walking into here? Jack was quiet for a long moment, his expression difficult to read in the dim light spilling from the shop's remaining functional lamp. Honestly, I don't know exactly what he'll try next. Men like Victor Hale, they don't think in terms of one plan. They think in terms of pressure points, and they keep pressing until something breaks. Financial pressure, social pressure. Sometimes if they're desperate and arrogant enough to physical pressure. That's not exactly reassuring. Wasn't meant to be. Jack opened his truck door, then paused, looking back at her with something that might have been the closest thing to warmth Emma had seen from him yet. But I'll tell you what I do know. Whatever he tries next, you're not facing it alone anymore. That much I can promise you. He drove off into the darkness, and Emma stood alone in her lot for a long moment afterward, staring up at the stars scattered across the vast Montana sky, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not safety exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt for the first time in weeks almost like hope. She had no idea that hope was about to be tested more severely than she could possibly imagine. The following Monday brought the first sign that Victor Hale had in fact decided to stop playing nice, exactly as he'd promised on that phone call Emma knew nothing about. Emma arrived at the shop before 6 in the morning as always, only to find a sheriff's deputy vehicle parked in her lot, lights off, engine idling. Her stomach dropped immediately. Is something wrong? The deputy, a young man named Officer Reyes, whom Emma vaguely recognized from around town, stepped out of his vehicle holding a clipboard, his expression apologetic but firm. Ms. Carter, I received a complaint yesterday evening regarding unpermitted commercial activity on this property, specifically regarding vehicles and personnel operating without proper business licensing. What are you talking about? This is a licensed auto repair shop. It's been licensed for 31 years. The complaint isn't about the shop's licensing, ma'am. It's about the individuals who were here yesterday afternoon, apparently performing repair work without being employed by your business or properly documented as contractors. There's also a noise complaint filed regarding excessive motorcycle activity disturbing the peace. Emma felt fury rising in her chest, hot and immediate. Someone filed a noise complaint about 11 motorcycles idling in my own private parking lot for an afternoon. Who filed that complaint? I'm not permitted to disclose the complainant's identity, ma'am. But Emma didn't need it disclosed. She already knew exactly who was behind it, and the realization made her hands shake with barely restrained anger. Officer Reyes, I understand you have a job to do, but I want you to understand something too. Those people were volunteers helping me repair equipment that was deliberately destroyed by men hired by a local businessman who's been trying to force me off this land for weeks. If you want to investigate something, maybe start there. Officer Reyes's expression flickered with something like sympathy, though his professional demeanor didn't waver. I hear you, Miss Carter, but my hands are tied on what I've been directed to investigate. I need you to provide documentation on anyone performing work here going forward, or I'll have no choice but to issue citations. He left shortly after having documented the visit, but issued no immediate citation, though the warning hung heavy in the air behind him. Emma called Jack the moment the deputy's car pulled away, her voice tight with frustration. He's coming after us through the county now, filed a noise complaint, threatened citations if your crew comes back to help without paperwork I don't even know how to produce on short notice. Jack's response came calm and measured, though Emma could hear the edge underneath it. Predictable. Men like Hale, when their first approach fails, they run straight to whatever official channels they can manipulate. Doesn't mean we stop, Emma. Just means we get smarter about how we move. Smarter how? Give me a few hours. I'll call you back. True to his word, Jack called back that afternoon with a plan that surprised Emma with its simplicity. Rather than having the crew work openly as volunteers, which invited exactly the kind of scrutiny Victor Hale had just weaponized, Jack proposed something different entirely. Frank's got a valid contractor's license, has for 20 years. Rosa's certified too through her old Army training, plus a civilian recertification she did a few years back. We route everything through them, officially paperwork and all completely above board. Slower maybe, but bulletproof. That could work, Emma said, relief flooding through her. That could actually work. It will work, Jack said, because we're not giving Victor Hale a single crack to slip through if we can help it. Over the following days, the shop began transforming under this new arrangement. Official paperwork filed for every contractor, every repair, every piece of equipment installed. Progress felt slower than the chaotic all-hands rush of that first afternoon, but it was steady, and more importantly, it was defensible against any further attempts at legal harassment. Emma began noticing something else during those days too, something she hadn't expected. Customers were returning. Word had apparently spread through Miller's Creek about what happened at Carter's Auto, about the mysterious crew of bikers who'd shown up to help rebuild what Victor Hale's men had destroyed, and rather than scaring people away, the story seemed to be drawing people toward her. "Heard what happened here," said Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who'd been bringing her ancient Buick to Emma's shop for years, dropping off her car for a routine oil change on Wednesday morning. "Heard some big developers sent thugs to smash up your equipment because you wouldn't sell them your land." "Where did you hear that?" Emma asked, startled. "Honey, this is Miller's Creek. Everybody's heard by now. My nephew works over at the sheriff's office, mentioned the deputy who came out here about some noise complaint, and one thing led to another." Mrs. Patterson patted Emma's hand with weathered fingers. "You tell that developer he can go straight to hell. Your daddy fixed my Buick for free 3 different times when money was tight after my husband passed. This town remembers people like Walt Carter. And we remember people who try to hurt his family too." Similar sentiments began arriving throughout the week. A local diner owner stopped by to offer free meals to anyone working on the shop's reconstruction. A retired school teacher brought over a casserole unprompted, simply because she'd heard Emma was working herself to exhaustion and figured she could use one less thing to worry about. Small gestures, individually modest, but collectively, they represented something Emma hadn't expected: an entire community quietly choosing sides. Victor Hale noticed too, and the notice did not sit well with him. Thursday afternoon brought Victor's next move, delivered not through hired muscle this time, but through something considerably more insidious. Emma received a call from her accountant, a harried man named Gerald, who handled her books on a modest monthly retainer, his voice tight with concern. "Emma, I need to tell you something, and I don't fully understand it myself yet." "What's going on, Gerald?" "Your business credit line, the one you've had open with First Montana Trust for the past 4 years, used mostly for parts inventory financing. It's been frozen, effective immediately. I called the bank this morning trying to understand why, and they cited some kind of internal risk reassessment triggered by, and I'm reading this directly from what they told me, irregular activity patterns associated with the account." Emma felt her stomach drop for what felt like the 100th time in 2 weeks. "What irregular activity? I haven't done anything different." "I don't know, Emma, but I want you to understand what this means practically. Without that credit line, you can't order parts on your usual terms. Everything becomes cash up front, which, given your current cash flow situation, is basically impossible." Emma finished for him, her voice hollow. "I'm sorry. I'll keep pushing on my end to find out what's really happening, but I wanted you to know immediately." Emma hung up the phone and sat motionless behind her counter for several long minutes, feeling the walls closing in around her once again, just as she'd begun to believe things might actually improve. She called Jack immediately, her composure fraying audibly in her voice. "He froze my credit line. My actual bank credit, the one I've had for years. How is that even possible? How does a real estate developer have that kind of reach into my banking relationships?" Jack's voice carried none of his usual calm certainty, this time an edge of genuine concern breaking through. "Emma, I need you to tell me the exact name of the bank." "First Montana Trust." There was a long pause on the line. That's the same bank holding your original loan. Yes. Emma, Jack's voice had gone very quiet, very serious. I need to make some calls. I'll come by this evening. He arrived just after dinner, his expression grimmer than Emma had seen it yet, and he wasted no time getting to the point once they sat down together in her small office. I made some calls, Jack said. Turns out Victor Hale isn't just a real estate developer buying up property around your shop. He sits on the board of directors for First Montana Trust's parent holding company. Has for the past 6 years. Emma stared at him, the implications crashing over her in the slow, sickening waves. He's my bank. He's been my bank this entire time. Not directly, not in a way that would show up on any paperwork you'd have seen, but he has enough influence on that board to make things happen behind the scenes that most people would never trace back to him. Your loan going to collections so fast, your credit line freezing without clear explanation. That's not coincidence, Emma. That's a man using every lever of institutional power he has access to, specifically targeting you. Then I'm finished, Emma said, her voice breaking for the first time in days. If he controls my bank, if he can freeze credit and call in loans whenever he wants, there's nothing I can do. He'll bleed me dry, no matter how many bikers show up to fix my equipment. Jack reached across the desk and, in a gesture that surprised Emma with its gentleness, placed his weathered hand over hers. Now you listen to me, and you listen carefully. A man abusing his position on a bank board to specifically target one small business owner because she refused to sell her land, that's not just unethical, Emma. Depending on how it's structured, that could be illegal. Banking regulations exist specifically to prevent exactly this kind of targeted institutional abuse. You think I should sue him? I think, Jack said slowly, that lawsuits take years and money you don't have. But I also think there are other ways to expose exactly what a man like Victor Hale is doing, ways that move faster and hit harder than any courtroom ever could. What kind of ways? Jack's expression shifted into something calculating, something that reminded Emma once again that this quiet old man carried decades of experience she still knew almost nothing about. Let me worry about that part. In the meantime, I want you focused on one thing and one thing only: keeping these doors open, keeping customers coming through them, and letting the whole town see exactly what kind of man is trying to destroy Walt Carter's daughter over a real estate deal. That night after Jack left, Emma sat alone in her apartment reviewing every scrap of paperwork related to her accounts, searching desperately for anything that might explain or counter what was happening. She found nothing conclusive, only mounting evidence of exactly how thoroughly and quietly Victor Hale had been maneuvering against her for weeks, possibly longer than she'd even realized. Around midnight, her phone rang an unknown number, and something about the late hour made her answer despite every instinct telling her not to. Ms. Carter, said a voice she didn't recognize, male, calm, professional, in a way that felt deliberately unsettling. I wanted to reach out personally to express my sincere hope that recent events haven't been too discouraging. Who is this? A friend of Victor's. I understand you've been having some difficulties lately. Banking troubles, equipment, concerns, that sort of thing. Really, it's such a shame to see a young woman struggling so unnecessarily when there's such an easy solution available. Emma's grip tightened on the phone. If you're calling to threaten me again, you can save your breath. I've already said no. I'm going to keep saying no. Threaten Ms. Carter, nobody's threatening anything. I'm simply pointing out that circumstances have a way of escalating when reasonable offers get repeatedly refused. Your new friends, the motorcycle enthusiasts, helping around your shop lately, I do hope they understand the kind of trouble they're inviting by getting involved in something that really isn't their concern. Leave them out of this. That's entirely up to you, Ms. Carter. Sell the property. This all becomes very simple very quickly. Refuse, and I'm afraid things may continue growing considerably more complicated for everyone involved. Sleep well. The line went dead before Emma could respond, and she sat in the darkness of her apartment, gripping her phone with white-knuckled hands, fear and fury warring inside her chest in equal, overwhelming measure. She called Jack immediately despite the hour, and he picked up on the second ring, sounding fully alert despite the late hour, as though he'd been expecting exactly this kind of call. Emma, what's wrong? She relayed the conversation as steadily as she could manage, her voice shaking despite every effort to control it, and when she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jack, are you there? I'm here. Jack said, his voice carrying a new hardness Emma hadn't heard from him before. Emma, I need you to do something for me. I need you to write down everything about that call, word for word, as close as you can remember it. Time it came and the number if it showed on your phone, everything. Why? Because that call just gave us something we didn't have before, Jack said. Evidence of direct intimidation explicitly connected to Hale's offer. That's not just aggressive business tactics anymore, Emma. That's a documented threat. And documented threats, when properly assembled with everything else, start building exactly the kind of case that brings real consequences down on men who think their money puts them above the law. You want to go to the police? Eventually, but not yet. Right now, I want to keep building. One incident is easy to dismiss as a misunderstanding. A pattern, Emma, a clear and documented pattern of harassment and institutional abuse. That's something no lawyer, no judge, and no reporter can ignore once it's properly assembled. Emma felt something steady settle in her chest for the first time since the phone call had jolted her out of whatever fragile calm she'd managed to build over the previous days. You've done this before, haven't you? Built cases like this? Once or twice, Jack said, something almost like grim humor coloring his voice. Get some sleep, Emma. Lock your doors. I'll be by first thing in the morning. Sleep didn't come easily that night, but Emma did eventually drift off exhausted beyond what fear could overcome, and when she woke the next morning, she found something waiting outside her shop that made her breath catch all over again. Parked in her lot, engine silent this time, sat 6 motorcycles. Instead of the previous week's 11, their riders standing in loose formation near the entrance, clearly having arrived sometime before dawn. Jack stood among them along with Frank and Rosa, and 3 faces Emma didn't recognize yet. What is this? Emma asked, stepping outside cautiously. Reinforcements, Jack said simply. After that call last night, I made a few more phone calls of my own. This is Miguel's brother Tommy, already met him briefly. That's Sam, retired police detective, spent 20 years working organized crime cases before he retired out to Wyoming. And that's Denise, does forensic accounting work, used to consult for the FBI on white-collar fraud investigations before she retired. Emma stared at the group, disbelief washing over her yet again. You called in a retired FBI consultant to look at my bank records. I called in someone who knows exactly what to look for when a man like Victor Hale starts abusing institutional power to target someone specifically, Jack said. Denise is going to need copies of everything, every statement, every communication you've had with First Montana Trust, going back at least a year. If there's a pattern of targeted interference, she'll find it. Denise stepped forward, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with silver hair cropped short and an expression that radiated quiet competence. Miss Carter, I want you to understand something important before we start. If what Jack's told me is accurate, and if I find what I expect to find, once I review your records, this stops being just your problem. This becomes a matter for state banking, regulators, possibly federal authorities, depending on how far the abuse extends. Men like Victor Hale, they build these operations assuming nobody will ever look closely enough to see the pattern. We're about to look very closely. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emma felt something shift inside her chest. Fear slowly giving way to something that felt dangerously close to genuine confidence. Where do we start? We start, Denise said, already pulling a laptop from her bag, with coffee and every piece of paper you can find related to your accounts. And then we start building the kind of case that ends careers like Victor Hale's. The work that followed over the next several days moved with a different energy than the previous week's chaotic scramble to repair physical equipment. This was quieter, more methodical Denise poring over bank statements and loan documents with meticulous focus, while Sam, the retired detective, began quietly reaching out to contacts he still maintained within Montana's State Banking Regulatory Office, testing the waters for exactly how a complaint like this might be received. Meanwhile, the shop itself continued its slow recovery. The new hydraulic lift, fully installed and tested by Frank, worked better than the original had even before its destruction. Customers continued arriving in steady numbers, many of them mentioning unprompted that they'd specifically chosen to bring their business to Emma rather than the larger chain repair shop on the highway, simply because word had spread about what Victor Hale was trying to do to her. But Victor Hale, predictably, did not remain quiet during this period of quiet rebuilding. On Saturday, exactly 10 days after the crew had first arrived, Emma received a certified letter from a law firm she didn't recognize informing her that Hale Development was filing a formal complaint regarding unlicensed commercial activity occurring on her property, citing the exact same volunteer labor issue the sheriff's deputy had raised weeks earlier, except now escalated to formal legal action rather than a simple warning. "He's trying to bury us in paperwork," Jack said grimly, reading through the letter Denise had spread across Emma's kitchen table that evening. "Classic pressure tactic. Force you to spend money on lawyers you don't have, defending against claims that probably won't hold up, but cost real time and money to fight regardless." "Can he actually win this?" Emma asked. "Doubtful," Denise said, not looking up from the letter. "Every contractor working on this property has proper licensing now, exactly like Jack arranged. This complaint's built on outdated information from before you corrected the paperwork issue. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is making you scared, making you spend money you don't have defending against a claim he probably knows won't stick, just to keep bleeding you dry from every possible direction." Emma rubbed her temples, exhaustion settling deep into her bones despite the growing support surrounding her. "This never stops, does it? Every time we solve one problem, he just creates three more." "That's exactly what desperate men do when their first plans fail," Jack said. "Which tells me something important. Emma, this isn't the behavior of a man who's confident he's going to win. This is the behavior of a man who's starting to panic." "He doesn't seem panicked to me." "He wouldn't. Men like Hale spent their entire lives learning to project confidence regardless of what's actually happening underneath. But look at his pattern. Hired thugs that failed. Banking manipulation that's about to blow up in his face once Denise finishes her documentation. Legal harassment over technicalities that don't actually hold up. That's not a strategic mastermind executing a plan, Emma. That's a man throwing everything he has at a wall, hoping something eventually sticks." Denise finally looked up from her laptop, her expression carrying the first hint of genuine excitement Emma had seen from her since she'd arrived. "Jack, you need to see this." Everyone gathered around her screen as she pulled up a series of transaction records highlighting specific entries with practiced efficiency. "I've been tracing the exact timeline of every account restriction placed on Emma's business. Every single one correlates precisely with board meeting dates at First Montana Trust's parent company. Victor Hale attended every single one of those meetings. This isn't circumstantial anymore. This is a documented, traceable pattern of a board member, directly weaponizing institutional banking authority to target a specific private citizen who refused his business proposal." "Is that enough to bring to regulators?" Emma asked, hope creeping into her voice for the first time in what felt like weeks. "It's enough to open a formal investigation," Denise said carefully. "Whether it's enough to end his career or bring criminal charges, that depends on how deep this pattern actually goes, and whether we can find more instances beyond just your case. Men like Victor Hale rarely do this kind of thing exactly once." Sam, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke up from where he leaned against the kitchen counter. "I made a few calls today, talked to an old contact who still works fraud cases for the state. Mentioned hypothetically, of course, a situation involving a board member using banking influence to target a private business. She got very interested very quickly. Apparently, there have been whispers about First Montana Trust's parent company for a while now. Nothing concrete enough to act on, but enough smoke that regulators have been watching." "So we're not the first," Emma said slowly, understanding dawning. "Probably not," Sam agreed, "which means if we can bring solid documented evidence, we're not just helping you, Emma. We're potentially helping every other person Victor Hale has quietly crushed over the years without anyone ever connecting the dots." The weight of that realization settled over the room, and Emma felt something shift inside her chest, the fear and exhaustion of the past 2 weeks beginning to transform into something with far more purpose behind it. This wasn't just about saving her father's shop anymore, though that mattered more to her than almost anything else in her life. This was about stopping a pattern of abuse that had likely been quietly destroying good people for years, hidden behind expensive suits and institutional legitimacy that nobody had ever thought to question closely enough. "What do you need from me?" Emma asked, looking around at the small group gathered in her kitchen. "Patience," Denise said. "This kind of case takes time to build properly. Rush it present incomplete evidence, and a man with Victor Hale's resources will bury it in legal maneuvering before it ever reaches anyone with actual authority to act. We build this carefully, we build it completely, and when we finally present it, it needs to be airtight." "And in the meantime," Emma asked, "he keeps attacking, keeps escalating, and I just wait." Jack's expression turned serious. his eyes meeting Emma's directly. In the meantime, you keep those doors open. You keep serving this town the way your father always did, and you let us handle the parts you can't see. That's the deal, Emma. That's always been the deal since the moment I walked into your shop that first day. Emma nodded slowly, though a knot of anxiety remained lodged firmly in her stomach. A growing sense that Jack's earlier warning about a desperate man escalating carried more weight than any of them wanted to fully acknowledge out loud. She was right to feel that anxiety, though she wouldn't understand exactly how right until 3 days later, when Victor Hale's next move arrived, not through banking manipulation or legal paperwork, but through something considerably more personal and far more dangerous than anything he'd attempted before. It began on Tuesday evening, nearly 2 weeks after the initial attack on her shop, when Emma's phone rang while she was closing up for the night. The caller ID showed her cousin's name, a young man named Tyler, who lived 2 towns over and worked at a hardware store, someone Emma rarely spoke with beyond occasional holiday gatherings. Tyler, everything okay? His voice, when it came through, carried a tightness that immediately set Emma on edge. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. And are you in some kind of trouble? Because 2 men came by my store today asking questions about you, about our family, about whether you had any other properties, any other assets, anywhere they might be able to reach if things at your shop don't work out the way they're hoping. Emma's blood ran cold. What exactly did they ask Tyler? They wanted to know about Mom, about whether she still lives alone out on the old property near Bozeman. They asked if she'd be someone who might convince you to reconsider whatever decision you were apparently struggling with. Emma, they knew things about our family they shouldn't have known. Private things. It scared me. Emma's hands began shaking uncontrollably, fury and terror colliding violently inside her chest. Her Aunt Linda, her mother's sister, was 73 years old and lived alone on a small property outside Bozeman, exactly as vulnerable as anyone Victor Hale could possibly target to increase pressure on Emma without directly threatening her again. Tyler listened to me very carefully. I need you to call your mom right now tonight and tell her to be careful to not open the door for anyone she doesn't recognize, to call the police immediately if anyone comes around asking strange questions. Emma, you're scaring me. What is actually going on? I'll explain everything soon, I promise. Right now, please just call her. Emma hung up and immediately dialed Jack, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the phone twice before connecting the call. Jack, he's going after my family now. My aunt out near Bozeman. 2 men were asking questions about her today, about whether she could pressure me into selling. There was a long, dangerous silence on the other end of the line before Jack finally spoke. And when he did, his voice carried a coldness Emma hadn't heard from him before, something that made the hair on her arms stand on end, despite everything they'd already survived together. He's crossed a line now, Jack said quietly. Threatening you directly, that's business ugly as it is. Involving your family, targeting an elderly woman living alone specifically to intimidate you into compliance, that's something else entirely. What do we do? Give me your aunt's exact address and phone number. I'm making calls tonight. Jack, what are you planning? The silence that followed carried weight. Emma could feel through the phone itself, and when Jack finally answered, his voice had dropped into something quiet and absolutely certain, the voice of a man who had made an irreversible decision and felt no hesitation whatsoever about following through on it. I'm calling in the rest of the network, Jack said. Every single person who owes a debt, every person who believes protecting good families from men like Victor Hale still means something in this country. Your aunt is not going to spend one single night alone and unprotected, not while I have breath left in my body to prevent it. And Victor Hale is about to learn exactly what happens when a man like him decides threatening an elderly widow is an acceptable business strategy. Emma sat frozen in her shop phone pressed against her ear, listening to the sound of a man beginning to move mountains on her behalf, and somewhere underneath the terror gripping her chest, a new and unfamiliar feeling began taking root. Not just hope this time, but something closer to certainty. A growing understanding that Victor Hale had made a catastrophic miscalculation the moment he decided threatening Emma's family was a viable strategy. She had absolutely no idea, sitting there in the darkness of her shop with her heart hammering against her ribs, that within 72 hours an entire town would begin choosing sides in a way that would make Victor Hale's carefully constructed empire tremble for the very first time, or that the quiet network Jack Callahan had spent 2 weeks assembling was about to reveal itself as something far larger, far more organized, and far more formidable than either Victor Hale or Emma herself could have possibly imagined. Jack hung up the phone that night and made 7 more calls before midnight, and by the time the sun rose over Bozeman the next morning, Emma's Aunt Linda woke to find 2 unfamiliar pickup trucks parked at the end of her driveway, engines off 2 quiet men sitting inside drinking coffee from a thermos, watching the road with patient, unblinking attention. She nearly called the police before her phone rang, Emma's voice rushing through an explanation that left the elderly woman stunned into silence. Emma, you're telling me strange men are watching my house because of something happening at your shop 3 hours away? I know how it sounds, Aunt Linda, but please just trust me on this. Trust Jack. He's not going to let anything happen to you. Who exactly is this Jack? Emma hesitated, realizing she still didn't have a complete answer to that question herself. Someone Dad helped a long time ago, someone who doesn't forget. Linda was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same stubborn steel that ran through the entire Carter family bloodline. Well, your father did always say the debts that matter most are the ones people choose to remember on their own. She paused. Tell your Jack I make a decent pot of coffee if his men get tired of that thermos. Emma laughed despite everything, a short surprise sound that cracked something loose in her chest, relief and exhaustion tangled together after a night of almost no sleep. By mid-morning, Jack arrived at the shop with news that hit Emma like a physical blow, though not the kind she expected. The 2 men who visited your cousin's hardware store, Jack said, spreading a folder across the counter. Sam tracked their vehicle through a contact at the county clerk's office, registered to a shell company. Guess who that shell company traces back to? Victor Hale. 3 layers removed, buried under enough paperwork that most people would never bother digging that deep. But Denise found the connection in about 40 minutes when she knew where to look. Jack tapped the folder. This isn't circumstantial anymore, Emma. This is documented proof that Hale Development sent men to gather information on your extended family with the explicit purpose of using your aunt as a leverage. Emma felt something cold and clear settle over her, replacing the raw fear of the previous night with something far steadier. Then we take it to the police. Right now. Not yet. Jack's voice remained calm, though his jaw was tight. One more piece, Emma. Denise is close to finishing the banking pattern. Sam's contact at the State Fraud Division wants a complete package, not fragments. We hand this over piecemeal. A good lawyer buries it in technicalities before it ever reaches a courtroom. We hand it over complete, undeniable, all at once. There's nowhere left for Victor Hale to hide. How close is close? 3 days, maybe 4. Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to trust the process, even as every instinct screamed at her to end this immediately. Okay, 3 days. Word of what happened to Linda spread through the extended family fast, and by Wednesday afternoon, something remarkable began happening that none of them had fully anticipated. Emma's second cousin, a truck driver named Pete, who ran freight routes across 3 states, showed up at the shop unannounced, his rig idling in the lot. Heard what almost happened to Aunt Linda? Pete said, climbing down from his cab. Heard about everything, actually. My dispatchers have been getting calls too, some concerned business associate asking questions about our fleet contracts, real subtle like, except it wasn't subtle at all once I put it together. Pete, I'm so sorry, I never meant to drag the whole family into this. Emma. Pete's expression turned serious. You didn't drag anybody anywhere. Some rich developer decided threatening a 73-year-old widow was an acceptable way to do business. That's not your fault. That's his choice, and he's about to find out this family doesn't scare that easy. He nodded toward his truck. I'm shifting 3 of my regular delivery routes through your shop for maintenance starting this week. Figure if he's trying to starve you of business, we start feeding you instead. That single conversation set something in motion that Emma hadn't anticipated, a quiet organic momentum building block by block through Miller's Creek and the surrounding towns. By Thursday, 2 more trucking companies had transferred fleet contracts to Carter's Auto, their owners citing almost identical reasoning that they'd heard about Victor Hale's tactics and wanted no part of doing business with anyone connected to him. The local diner started a small collection jar near the register, unprompted, with a handwritten sign reading, "Support Carter's Auto and Customers." Emma had never met, began dropping cash into it, $5 here, 20 there, small gestures that added up to something Emma found difficult to look at without her throat tightening. Danny noticed the shift too, watching customers file in throughout the week with an energy the shop hadn't seen in months. Boss, I gotta say in some twisted way that Hail Guy might be the best thing that ever happened to your business. That's a strange way to look at attempted extortion, Danny. Maybe, but look around. 2 weeks ago, we were drowning. Now we've got more work than we can handle. Half this town suddenly remembers exactly why your dad mattered to them. And we've got a small army of retired outlaws fixing our equipment for free. Danny shrugged. I'm just saying, sometimes evil people build the exact opposition that ends up destroying them. Emma didn't have an answer for that, but she felt the truth in it settling somewhere deep in her chest. Friday brought Jack back to the shop with an expression Emma hadn't seen on him before, something between grim satisfaction and genuine urgency. Denise finished the banking pattern, he said without preamble. It's worse than we thought, Emma. Much worse. He laid out documents across her office desk, walking her through findings that made her stomach twist with each new revelation. Victor Hale hadn't just targeted her. Over the past 6 years, Denise had identified at least 11 other small business owners across 3 counties who'd experienced nearly identical patterns, refused a below-market offer from Hale Development, then suffered sudden, unexplained banking restrictions traceable to board meeting dates Victor had attended. 11 other people, Emma whispered, staring at the names listed on Denise's summary sheet. He's been doing this for years. At least 11 that Denise found evidence for, Jack said. Probably more that either settled quietly or never realized what was actually happening to them. Most people don't have access to a forensic accountant willing to dig this deep. What happened to them, the other 11? Jack's expression darkened. 9 of them sold, couldn't survive, the pressure didn't have anyone to fight back with. 2 held out, went bankrupt anyway from the financial strangulation before Hale ever got their land, lost everything regardless. Emma sat back in her chair, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. He destroyed 9 families to build his empire and nobody ever caught him. Nobody ever built a case complete enough to catch him, Jack corrected gently. Until now. Sam arrived 20 minutes later, having driven straight from a meeting with his contact at the State Fraud Division, his expression carrying an intensity that told Emma something significant had shifted. They're interested, Sam said, dropping into the chair across from Emma's desk. Very interested. My contact pulled in someone from the Montana Department of Justice this afternoon after seeing Denise's preliminary summary. They want the complete package by Monday. That fast? Emma asked. Apparently there have been complaints filed against First Montana Trust's parent company before, exactly like I suspected. Nothing that ever went anywhere because nobody could connect the dots the way Denise just did. This isn't just going to be an investigation into you anymore, Emma. This is going to be an investigation into a 6-year pattern of institutional fraud and coordinated intimidation. Relief and fear tangled together in Emma's chest, a strange, dizzying combination. What happens to me during all this to the shop? You keep doing exactly what you've been doing, Jack said firmly. You keep those doors open. You let this town keep showing Victor Hale exactly what real loyalty looks like. And you let Denise and Sam finish building something so complete that no lawyer on earth can talk their way out of it. That evening, after everyone else had gone, Jack lingered in the shop while Emma closed up something clearly weighing on him that he hadn't said yet. There's something else, he finally admitted. Something I haven't told you. Emma's stomach tightened. What is it? Victor Hale knows we're close. Sam's contact confirmed the fraud division reached out to First Montana Trust Compliance Department yesterday for preliminary records, standard procedure, before any formal investigation opens. Which means Victor almost certainly knows by now that something's coming. How do you know he knows? Jack's jaw tightened. Because a man like Victor Hale, cornered and desperate, doesn't sit quietly and wait to get caught. He panics. And panicking men do reckless things. Emma felt the familiar dread creeping back into her chest, the fragile sense of progress suddenly feeling perilously thin. What kind of reckless things? I don't know yet, Jack admitted, which somehow frightened her more than if he'd offered a concrete answer. But I want you staying somewhere else for the next few nights. Not here, not alone above the shop. Jack, I'm not running from my own home. I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to be smart for a few days while this reaches its breaking point. His eyes held hers, steady and serious. Emma, I made a promise a long time ago that I intended to keep no matter what it cost me. I am not going to fail that promise now, 3 days before it finally pays off, because you decided stubbornness was more important than safety. Emma wanted to argue every independent instinct in her body rebelling against the idea of being managed or protected against her own judgment. But something in Jack's expression, a rare flicker of genuine fear beneath the weathered calm, stopped her. Okay, she said quietly. A few nights, but Jack, I need you to promise me something too. What's that? Whatever happens next, you tell me everything. No more protecting me from information because you think it's easier that way. I've earned the right to know exactly what I'm walking into. Jack studied her for a long moment, something like respect passing behind his weathered eyes. Fair enough, deal. Emma spent that night at Danny's place, his wife setting up the guest room without asking a single question, simply understanding that whatever was happening mattered enough that Emma needed somewhere safe. Sleep came in fitful pieces, her mind cycling endlessly through everything Jack had revealed. The 11 other families, the years of quiet, undetected devastation. Victor Hale had left scattered across 3 counties. Saturday morning brought a call that shattered whatever fragile calm remained. Emma's phone rang just after 7. Rosa's voice tight with urgency the moment Emma answered. Emma, get to the shop right now. Something's happened. Emma's heart lurched into her throat. What kind of something? Just get here. Jack's already on his way. Emma broke every speed limit getting back to Carter's auto, arriving to find Rosa and Frank standing near the front entrance, both their expressions grim, and beyond them spray-painted across the shop's front window in harsh, dripping red letters, a message that made Emma's blood run cold. Last warning. Beneath its smaller, almost an afterthought that somehow felt far more menacing than the message itself, a single detail that made Emma's knees go weak. Her aunt's address, written out in full. When did this happen? Emma demanded, her voice shaking. Sometime overnight, Frank said. Security camera caught someone around 3 a.m, but they knew exactly where the blind spot was. Whoever did this had scouted this location carefully. Jack's truck screeched into the lot moments later, and he was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped his expression, carrying a coldness Emma had never seen on him before. Something that transformed his usually calm demeanor into something that looked for just a moment genuinely dangerous. He's escalating exactly the way I feared, Jack said, staring at the spray paint, with an intensity that made Emma take an involuntary step backward. This isn't subtle anymore. This is a man who knows the walls are closing in and has decided desperation is worth the risk. He wrote my aunt's address on my window, Jack. He wants me to know he can reach her whenever he wants. I know. Jack turned to face her directly, his eyes hard. Which is exactly why I already have 4 people stationed near her property as of this morning, and why that's not changing until this entire situation resolves completely one way or another. Emma felt tears, threatening exhaustion, and fear finally cracking through the composure she'd been fighting so hard to maintain. How much longer, Jack? How much longer until Denise and Sam finish whatever they need to finish? Monday, Jack said. 2 more days. 2 more days. Emma repeated, staring at the message on her window, the raw threat of it settling into her bones. Can we survive 2 more days? Jack's expression softened just slightly, though the hardness underneath never fully disappeared. Emma, listen to me. Victor Hale just made his first genuine mistake in this entire campaign. Threatening you privately, manipulating banks quietly, that's the behavior of a careful man protecting himself. Spray painting threats on a public storefront window, that's evidence. That's a documented photograph, time-stamped criminal act that any prosecutor in this state would love to add to an already overwhelming case. Sam arrived shortly after photographing the vandalism methodically before it could be cleaned. And by afternoon, Officer Reyes returned, this time without the reluctant, apologetic demeanor he'd carried during his previous visit weeks earlier. This is different, Reyes said, examining the message grimly. Direct threat, specific address, reference security footage, even if it's limited. This gives us actual grounds to open a formal harassment investigation separate from whatever the state's already looking into. Separate investigations working the same target, Jack murmured to Emma once Reyes had left. That's exactly what we need right now. Multiple pressure points all converging at once. A man can maybe survive one investigation with enough lawyers and enough money. Surviving 3 or 4 simultaneous investigations, each uncovering different pieces of the same rotten foundation, that's a different story entirely. Sunday passed in tense, watchful quiet. The shop closed for the first time in weeks. Emma spending the day at Danny's house while Jack's network maintained careful, constant watch over both the shop and her aunt's property outside Bozeman. Nothing happened, no further incidents, though the waiting itself felt like its own particular form of torture every hour, stretching taut with anticipation of whatever might come next. Monday morning arrived with a phone call that changed everything. Denise called just after 8, her voice carrying an edge of triumph Emma hadn't heard from her before. It's done. Complete package filed with the Montana Department of Justice Fraud Division an hour ago. 6 years of documented banking abuse, 11 confirmed victims beyond your case. Direct evidence connecting Victor Hale to coordinated intimidation campaigns, and now thanks to Saturday night's little vandalism display, a fresh criminal harassment charge with actual photographic evidence. What happens now? Emma asked, hardly daring to breathe. Now, Denise said, the state opens a formal investigation. Given the scope of what we found, I'd expect subpoenas within days, possibly a temporary board suspension, while First Montana Trust's parent company conducts its own internal review to avoid regulatory penalties. Men like Victor Hale, once the paperwork starts moving, it moves fast, and it moves in directions they can't fully control anymore. Emma allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a small flicker of genuine hope, cautious but real, settling into the exhausted corners of her chest. That hope lasted exactly 6 hours. Jack called just after 2 that afternoon, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately extinguished whatever fragile relief Emma had allowed herself to feel. Emma, where are you right now? At the shop, bye. Get everyone out, now. Sam just intercepted radio chatter through a contact monitoring local frequencies. Victor Hale knows about the investigation. He knows it's already been filed, and he's not planning to wait around and let the legal system take its course. Emma's blood turned to ice. What is he planning? Jack's answer when it came carried a weight that would haunt Emma for the rest of her life. He's coming for the shop tonight, Emma. All of it. Not thugs with crowbars this time. Something much bigger, much more final. I need you and everyone else out of that building within the hour, and I need every single person in our network converging on Miller's Creek before sundown. Emma stood frozen behind her counterphone pressed against her ear, staring out at the shop her father had built, the shop that had survived 31 years of honest work, weeks of coordinated destruction, and a community's fierce, unexpected loyalty, now facing something Jack's voice made unmistakably clear might be the final desperate act of a cornered and dangerous man. Jack, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. What exactly is he planning to do? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Emma's heart began hammering against her ribs before Jack finally answered, his voice grim and absolutely certain, in a way that told her the answer, whatever it turned out to be, was going to be far worse than anything they had faced so far. Whatever it is, Jack said quietly, we're not going to be caught unprepared. Get out of that shop, Emma. Right now, I'm calling in everyone. Emma grabbed her keys with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, locking the front door out of habit, even though some distant part of her brain understood that a locked door wasn't going to matter tonight. Danny was already outside, engine running, waving her toward his truck. Boss, get in. Jack called me too. He said everyone. What does that even mean, everyone? I don't know, but I trust him. Get in. They pulled out of the lot just as the sun began sinking low over the hills, and Emma twisted in her seat to look back at the shop shrinking behind them, the faded red letters of her father's sign catching the last orange light of the day, and something in her chest tightened painfully at the thought of what might be waiting for that building by morning. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jack. Aunt's safe, extra people with her now. Focus on the shop. Emma texted back with trembling thumbs. What is he planning? The response came a moment later. Don't know yet. Won't matter. We'll be ready either way. Danny drove them to a diner on the edge of town, the same one that had started the collection jar for Emma weeks earlier. And Emma found herself staring at her own reflection in the darkened window, hardly recognizing the exhausted, hollow-eyed woman looking back at her. You okay? Danny asked quietly. No, Emma admitted. I keep thinking about my dad's shop, everything he built, and some part of me feels like I already know how this ends tonight. Like I'm going to lose it no matter what any of us do. Don't talk like that. I'm scared, Danny. I'm allowed to be scared. Danny reached over and squeezed her shoulder, an awkward but sincere gesture from a man who wasn't naturally comfortable with emotional moments. Yeah, you're allowed. But Emma, think about everything that's happened these past few weeks. Think about how many people showed up when they didn't have to. Jack didn't call in a favor tonight. He called in an army. Emma wanted desperately to believe that would be enough. 3 hours away, in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Billings, a retired postal worker named Harold Reeves received a phone call he'd been half expecting for 11 years, ever since a stranger on a dark highway had helped him and his late wife when their car broke down in a snowstorm with no cell service and temperatures dropping toward zero. That stranger's name had been Jack Callahan, and Harold had never forgotten the quiet, unshakable kindness of a man who'd stopped for two frightened strangers when a dozen other vehicles had simply driven past. "Whatever you need," Harold said before Jack had even finished explaining the situation. "I'll be there within 2 hours." Similar calls rippled outward across 4 states that evening, reaching men and women who had at some point in their lives received something from Jack Callahan, or from someone connected to him, something that mattered enough that the debt had never fully left their minds. A woman in Idaho who'd once been helped through a custody battle by a lawyer Jack had quietly connected her with. A rancher in Wyoming whose barn Jack himself had helped rebuild after a fire, working 3 straight days without asking for a single dollar in return. A young mechanic in Spokane who owed his entire career to an apprenticeship Jack had arranged for him after a rough start in life that most people had simply written off. None of them asked detailed questions. All of them said yes. Back in Miller's Creek, Victor Hale sat in his office on the top floor of the tallest building in town, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains, a tumbler of expensive scotch untouched on his desk. Preston Cole stood near the window, his expression carefully neutral, in the way of a man accustomed to executing distasteful orders without visible reaction. "You're certain about tonight?" Victor asked, not looking up from the documents spread across his desk, the very documents Denise had filed with the state that morning, obtained through channels Victor still maintained inside the fraud division, despite the investigation targeting him directly. The crews assembled. 12 men, 3 trucks, everything needed to make the property structurally unrecoverable. Fire demolition equipment enough to ensure there's nothing left worth investigating by the time this investigation of theirs actually gathers momentum. And if anyone's inside, Preston's expression didn't shift. "Then that becomes an unfortunate accident during an act of vandalism, Mr. Hale. Tragic, but not something that traces back to us." Victor finally looked up, something cold and absolutely certain settling behind his eyes. "Do it tonight, before this investigation gathers any more momentum. If there's no shop left standing, there's no property worth fighting over, no evidence left to seize, and no reason for anyone to keep digging into ancient loan documents and board meeting minutes. And the Carter woman, make sure she understands this is what happens to people who refuse reasonable offers." Victor's voice carried no hesitation at all. "Make sure everyone in this town understands it." Preston nodded once and left the office without another word, already dialing a number on his phone before the door had fully closed behind him. By 9 that evening, Jack's network had assembled at a staging point 3 miles outside Miller's Creek, an abandoned grain elevator lot that offered clear sight lines in every direction. Emma stood beside Jack's truck, staring in disbelief at the growing collection of motorcycles and pickup trucks, filling the gravel lot, headlights cutting through the deepening darkness, engines rumbling in low patient idle. "Jack," Emma whispered, counting faces she didn't recognize. Weathered men and women who had driven for hours on nothing more than a phone call and a decades-old debt of honor. "How many people are here?" 31 last I counted." Jack said, his eyes scanning the gathering crowd with the focused calm of a man who had clearly done this kind of coordination before long ago in circumstances Emma still knew almost nothing about. "More coming. Some won't make it in time. Doesn't matter. We've got enough." "Enough for what? Exactly, Jack. What are we actually walking into tonight?" Sam approached from a cluster of men studying a hand-drawn map of the property spread across the hood of a truck, his expression grim. "Got confirmation 20 minutes ago from a contact inside the sheriff's office. Multiple vehicles spotted moving toward Carter's auto, loaded with equipment consistent with demolition, possibly incendiary materials." "This isn't another warning, Emma. This is exactly what we feared." Emma's stomach dropped violently. "He's going to burn it down." "We're not going to let that happen," Jack said, his voice carrying an absolute unshakable certainty that steadied something trembling deep inside Emma's chest. "Everyone here tonight understands exactly what's at stake. We're not here to fight, Emma. We're here to stand, and standing, when there's enough of us doing it together is sometimes more powerful than any fight could ever be. What if he doesn't back down? What if he sends people who are actually willing to hurt someone? Jack's expression turned serious, something old and hardened flickering behind his eyes. Then we protect each other exactly like we've always done. But Emma listened to me carefully. Victor Hale built his entire life around intimidating people who stand alone. Tonight, for the first time, he's about to discover what happens when he tries that strategy against people who never learned how to stand alone in the first place. Emma called the police the moment Sam's information was confirmed, her voice shaking as she relayed everything to a dispatcher who promised units would be sent immediately, though Millers Creek's small sheriff's department covered a massive rural territory, and Emma understood with sick clarity that any response might arrive minutes too late to prevent whatever was already in motion. Then she called Jack, though he was standing right beside him. Some instinct telling her the moment needed to be marked, remembered, spoken aloud rather than simply understood in silence. "I already know," Jack said before she could finish explaining. "Stay inside the truck, Emma. Whatever happens next, I need you safe and out of the direct line of anything dangerous. I'm not hiding while you all risk everything for my father's shop." "This isn't about hiding," Jack said, his voice softening slightly even as urgency colored every word. "This is about making sure Victor Hale's crew has one less thing to threaten if things turn ugly. You being safe lets the rest of us focus completely on protecting that building and everyone standing near it. That's not weakness, Emma. That's strategy." Emma reluctantly agreed, climbing into the passenger seat of Jack's truck. As the convoy began moving toward Carter's auto headlights and taillights stretching in a long, rumbling procession through the darkened Montana countryside, more vehicles joining from side roads as they went. Jack's network converging from every direction, like tributaries feeding into a single unstoppable river. The shop came into view just after 10 that night, and what Emma saw waiting there stole the breath completely from her lungs. 3 unmarked trucks sat parked near the entrance, and roughly a dozen men moved around the property with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before, fuel cans visible in the glow of portable work lights, crowbars, and heavier demolition tools scattered near the building's foundation. One man was already working at the base of the structure with what looked unmistakably like the early stages of setting a controlled demolition point. "Oh, God," Emma whispered, tears springing instantly to her eyes. "Jack, they're really going to do it." "Not tonight," Jack said, his jaw tight, already reaching for his radio to coordinate the approaching convoy. "Not while we're still breathing." What happened next would become the story Emma told for the rest of her life, the moment she would return to again and again, whenever she needed to remember exactly what human loyalty was capable of when it refused to bend. The silence of the rural Montana night shattered all at once, as headlights began appearing from every direction, dozens of motorcycles and trucks converging on the property, simultaneously, engines rumbling in a deep rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. The demolition crew froze mid-motion, fuel cans and crowbars forgotten, as an overwhelming tide of vehicles surrounded the property on all sides. Headlights cutting through the darkness in blinding, unstoppable waves. Jack's people didn't shout. They didn't rev their engines aggressively or make any threatening gestures at all. They simply arrived, dismounted with quiet, deliberate purpose, and began forming a solid human perimeter around the entire building, shoulder to shoulder, gray-haired veterans and weathered ranchers and retired mechanics, standing in absolute unbroken silence, facing down 12 armed demolition men with nothing but their sheer, overwhelming presence. The broad-shouldered man Emma recognized instantly from the original attack weeks earlier, the one who had personally delivered Victor's threat, stepped forward from the demolition crew, his expression flickering between confusion and the first genuine cracks of fear Emma had ever seen on him. "This isn't your fight," he called out, though his voice carried noticeably less confidence than it had during that first terrifying afternoon. Jack stepped forward from the crowd, standing directly in front of the man, his weathered frame somehow radiating an authority that made even the demolition crew's leader visibly hesitate. "You're wrong," Jack said, his voice calm, carrying easily across the sudden tense silence. "This became everyone's fight the moment you decided threatening an elderly widow was an acceptable business tactic. It became everyone's fight the moment you tried to burn down 31 years of honest work because a rich man couldn't accept the word no. We have orders. And we have 31 years of debts finally coming due," Jack said. "You're outnumbered 3-1, standing in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by people who have absolutely nothing to lose and everything to protect." I'd strongly suggest you and your men reconsider whatever Victor Hale is paying you, because it isn't nearly enough to cover what happens if this goes any further tonight. For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved, the tension stretching taut enough that Emma felt certain something violent was about to erupt, despite everything Jack had promised her. Then from somewhere behind the demolition crew, red and blue lights began flashing against the darkness. 3 sheriff's vehicles arriving in rapid succession, followed moments later by 2 additional units from the State Highway Patrol that Sam had apparently arranged through his contacts hours earlier. The demolition crew's leader looked around at the overwhelming scene surrounding him, at the silent wall of bikers refusing to move, at the approaching police vehicles, at fuel cans and demolition tools that suddenly looked less like professional equipment and more like damning evidence of exactly what they'd been sent here to do. "Stand down," he finally said to his men, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Load up. We're gone." They abandoned the site with visible haste, climbing into their trucks and pulling away just as the first sheriff's deputy stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight sweeping across the scene with obvious confusion at the sheer scale of what he was witnessing. "Somebody want to explain what's happening here?" the deputy called out. Jack stepped forward calmly, gesturing toward the fuel cans and demolition tools left scattered near the building's foundation. "Attempted arson and demolition, officer. We received advance warning and arrived in time to prevent it. I'd recommend collecting that equipment as evidence before anyone disturbs it further." Emma, unable to stay in the truck any longer, despite Jack's earlier instructions, climbed out and ran toward the scene, her eyes taking in the abandoned tools, the fuel cans, the terrifying proof of exactly how close her father's legacy had come to disappearing forever in a single devastating night. "They were really going to burn it down," she said, her voice trembling. "All of it. Everything my father built." Detective Sam moved quickly among the officers now arriving, already coordinating the collection of evidence with the practiced efficiency of his former career, photographing license plates from the fleeing trucks that several bystanders had managed to capture before the vehicles disappeared into the darkness. "We got plates on at least 2 of the trucks," Sam confirmed, showing Emma and Jack the photos on his phone. Combined with the fuel cans, the demolition equipment, and Denise's existing documentation connecting everything back to Hale development, this just became exactly the kind of undeniable catastrophic evidence that ends a man's career overnight. Emma stood in the glow of headlights and flashing police lights, surrounded by dozens of strangers who had become something far closer to family over the course of a few impossible weeks, staring at the shop that still stood untouched, save by a margin of minutes that felt almost too narrow to comprehend. "He's going to know this failed within the hour," Jack said quietly, standing beside her. "A man like Victor Hale, watching his last desperate move collapse this completely, that's not the end of his panic, Emma. That's the beginning of something much worse for him." "What do you mean?" Jack's expression carried a grim certainty that made Emma's chest tighten all over again. "I mean, cornered men make their most dangerous mistakes in the final hours before everything collapses around them. Tonight wasn't the last move, Emma. It was just the loudest one." Sirens continued approaching in the distance, more units responding to what had rapidly become one of the largest coordinated law enforcement responses Millers Creek had seen in decades. And somewhere across town, in an office on the top floor of the tallest building in the city, Victor Hale received a phone call informing him that his demolition crew had fled empty-handed, that police had arrived with overwhelming evidence, that dozens of witnesses now existed who could testify directly to his involvement. He sat in absolute silence for a long moment after the call ended, staring out at the same view he'd studied countless times over the past several weeks, watching the flashing lights of police vehicles clustered around Carter's auto in the distance, understanding with sudden sickening clarity that everything he had spent 6 years carefully building was now standing on the very edge of complete and total collapse. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his phone again, dialing a different number this time, one he hadn't needed to use in years, his voice carrying none of its usual polished confidence when the call finally connected. "I need you to get me out of the state," Victor Hale said quietly. "Tonight, before this gets any worse than it already is." But some debts, some patterns of destruction, built carefully across years, and multiple victims could not simply be outrun by a man boarding a private plane in the middle of the night. And Victor Hale was about to discover exactly how far Jack Callahan's network extended and exactly how completely a lifetime of quiet loyalty could close every single door a desperate, guilty man might try to escape through. The private plane Victor Hale had arranged never left the ground. State troopers were waiting at the airfield when his car pulled up just before 2 in the morning. And by the time Emma heard the news the following afternoon, Victor Hale had already been processed, fingerprinted, and released on bail. So restrictive, it required him to surrender his passport before he'd even finished signing the paperwork. "They got him," Sam said, standing in Emma's shop with his phone still in hand, relaying details from his contact inside the fraud division. Attempted arson, conspiracy, criminal intimidation, and that's before the state banking regulators even finished their portion of the case. Denise's documentation on the other 11 victims is already circulating through the DA's office. This isn't a man walking away with a fine and an apology, Emma. This is a man facing real prison time. Emma stood behind her counter, one hand pressed flat against the worn wood her father had installed decades earlier, feeling the news settle into her chest in slow, disbelieving waves. 2 weeks ago, she'd been standing in the wreckage of her father's life's work, certain she was about to lose everything. Now the man responsible for all of it was in a jail cell, and her shop, battered but unbroken, still stood exactly where it always had. "I don't know how to feel," she admitted quietly. "Relieved, I guess, but also just exhausted. Like I've been holding my breath for weeks and I still can't quite let it out." "That's normal," Jack said, appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Emma without being asked. "Fear doesn't leave the body just because the danger's gone, Emma. Give it time. It'll catch up eventually." Over the following days, the full scope of what Denise and Sam had uncovered began working its way through the state's legal machinery with a momentum that surprised even Jack. First Montana Trust's parent company, facing catastrophic regulatory exposure, moved swiftly to distance itself from Victor Hale, entirely removing him from the board and issuing a public statement expressing profound concern over allegations that only weeks earlier they had almost certainly known about and quietly ignored. The 9 business owners who had sold their properties years earlier under similar pressure began coming forward once news of the investigation spread through local media, their stories echoing Emma's with painful familiarity. A bakery owner in Bozeman, a family-run lumberyard near Kalispell, a small trucking company outside Butte. Each of them had believed for years that they'd simply made bad business decisions, that the loss of their livelihoods had been their own failure rather than the deliberate result of a wealthy man's calculated cruelty. "You have no idea what this means." One of them, a woman named Carol, who'd lost her family bakery 6 years earlier, told Emma over the phone one evening, her voice thick with emotion Emma understood all too well. "For 6 years, I've carried this guilt, thinking I just wasn't good enough to save my mother's business. Finding out it was never my fault that a powerful man deliberately destroyed me because I said no to his offer that changes everything, Emma. That changes how I've understood the worst thing that ever happened to me." Emma held on to that conversation for days afterward, understanding with growing clarity that this fight had never really been just about her father's shop. It had been about every quiet, isolated business owner who'd faced Victor Hale alone and had no idea that dozens of others shared their exact same nightmare, scattered and disconnected, each of them believing their destruction was a personal failure rather than a symptom of the same predator's pattern. 2 of the former victims decided to reopen their businesses once the investigation made national headlines, drawing an outpouring of community support that mirrored what had happened in Miller's Creek. Carol's Bakery reopened within a month, funded partly by a crowdfunding campaign that strangers across the country contributed to after reading about the case. Meanwhile, back at Carter's, auto life slowly began settling into something resembling normalcy, though normalcy now looked considerably different than it had before the wreckage of that first devastating afternoon. The shop was busier than it had ever been, customers arriving not just from Miller's Creek, but from towns Emma had never even serviced before. Many of them explicitly mentioning that they wanted to support the shop that had stood up to Victor Hale when so many others hadn't been able to. Frank finished the last of the equipment repairs by the end of that first week after the failed demolition attempt, standing back to admire the fully restored hydraulic lift with obvious satisfaction. "Better than new," he declared, wiping his hands on a rag. "Your daddy would be proud of how this place looks now, Emma. He'd be more proud of the people who fixed it," Emma said, watching Rosa organize the newly reorganized tool while watching Miguel and Tommy running diagnostics on a customer's truck with the same careful precision they'd brought to every task over the past several weeks. I still don't fully understand why all of you did this. Why you kept coming back day after day for someone you'd never met before Jack made a phone call. Rosa looked up from her work, her expression thoughtful. You want the honest answer, Emma? Please. Most of us spent years riding with the clubs that got a reputation we didn't deserve. Outlaws, criminals, dangerous men and women who couldn't be trusted. But that was never the whole truth, not for people like Jack, not for most of us who rode alongside him. The code we lived by, the real one underneath all the leather and the noise, it was always about loyalty, about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, about remembering debts other folks forgot the moment they became inconvenient. She gestured around the shop. Your father lived by that same code, Emma. He just never called it anything special. He just called it being a decent human being. When Jack told us what was happening here, none of us needed convincing. We just needed an address. Emma felt tears threatening again, though these carried none of the exhausted despair of weeks earlier. Something entirely different, warmer, settling into her chest instead. The formal charges against Victor Hale expanded significantly over the following 2 weeks as investigators uncovered additional evidence. Financial records revealing offshore accounts, communications proving he'd personally authorized the arson attempt, testimony from Preston Cole, who, facing his own potential prison sentence, agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge. He's talking, Sam told Emma and Jack one afternoon, having just returned from a meeting with the district attorney's office. Cole's giving them everything. Every order Victor gave, every threat authorized, every dollar paid to intimidate business owners across 3 counties. This isn't just going to trial anymore, Emma. Given what Cole's providing, Victor Hale's lawyers are already exploring plea deal options because there's simply no version of a trial that ends well for him now. What kind of sentence are we talking about? Emma asked. Depends on how the plea negotiations go, but given the scope, the arson attempt alone, plus conspiracy, plus the banking fraud charges, we're likely looking at somewhere between 12 and 20 years, depending on what Cole's cooperation ultimately earns him in exchange. Sam's expression carried grim satisfaction. A man like Victor Hale, used to buying his way out of every consequence he's ever faced, about to spend the better part of the rest of his life exactly where he belongs. Emma absorbed that news slowly, feeling something complicated settle over her. Not quite triumph, not quite relief, something closer to a heavy, exhausted sense of justice finally arriving after weeks of terror she still hadn't fully processed. That evening, Jack found her sitting alone in the back office long after the shop had closed, staring at her father's old coffee mug, still sitting untouched on the corner of the desk where it had rested for over 2 years. You okay? Jack asked, settling into the chair across from her. I keep thinking about what would have happened you hadn't been sitting in my waiting room that first day, Emma admitted quietly. If you'd just been some random customer who witnessed what happened and drove away without ever coming back, I would have sold Jack. I know I would have. I was so close to giving up before any of this even really started. You don't know that for certain. I do, actually. I sat alone in my apartment that first night, seriously considering it. $400,000 clean and simple versus fighting a man with unlimited resources and no conscience at all. Emma shook her head slowly. I'm not sure I would have found the strength to keep fighting without you and everyone else showing up exactly when you did. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the desk in front of him. Can I tell you something, Emma? Something I haven't said yet. Of course. The debt I owed your father, the one I told you about fixing my truck for free all those years ago, that was real. Every word of it was true. But it wasn't the only reason I kept coming back here every Wednesday for the better part of a year before Victor Hale ever showed up. He met her eyes directly. Your father used to talk about you back when I'd stop by for coffee sometimes before you took over the shop full time. He talked about how stubborn you were, how you refused to quit anything once you'd committed to it, how proud he was watching you learn this trade, even though half the men in this town assumed a woman couldn't run a shop like this on her own. Emma felt her breath catch. I didn't know that. He never told me you two talked. He was proud of you long before any of this happened, Emma. I think some part of me kept coming back here after he passed because I wanted to see if his pride had been justified. Wanted to see the daughter he talked about so much finally step into her own. Jack's weathered face softened into something rare, something close to genuine warmth. Watching you fight for this place the way you did, refusing every single offer to walk away, no matter how much easier it would have been, that told me everything I needed to know. Your father was right about you. He always was. Emma reached across the desk, covering Jack's weathered hand with her own, unable to speak past the emotion suddenly thick in her throat. The following weeks brought a steady stream of updates as Victor Hale's case moved through the legal system with increasing momentum. His lawyers, facing the overwhelming weight of Cole's testimony, combined with Denise's financial documentation, eventually negotiated a plea deal that spared the state a lengthy trial in exchange for a guaranteed 18-year sentence, along with full restitution payments to every victim identified throughout the investigation, including Emma. When the restitution check arrived at Carter's Auto, a modest but meaningful sum covering the damaged equipment and lost business income from those terrifying weeks, Emma didn't cash it immediately. She sat with it for several days, looking at it, sitting on her father's old desk, understanding it represented something larger than money, a formal, undeniable acknowledgement that everything Victor Hale had done to her had been real, documented, and finally completely accounted for. The trucking contracts that had shifted to Carter's Auto during the crisis remained in place even after the immediate danger passed, business owners across the region citing loyalty and gratitude rather than any lingering fear as their reason for staying. Carter's Auto and Diesel Repair, once teetering on the edge of bank foreclosure, transformed within a matter of months into the busiest independent repair shop in 3 counties. Emma finally able to hire 2 additional employees, finally able to pay down her original loan ahead of schedule, finally able to breathe without the constant crushing weight of financial catastrophe hanging over every single day. Danny noticed the change in her, most of all watching Emma laugh more freely during slow afternoons, watching her walk through the shop with a lightness that had been entirely absent during those brutal early months after her father's death. "You look different," he told her one afternoon, watching her review invoices with none of the frantic anxiety that had once accompanied that particular task. "I feel different," Emma admitted. "For the first time since Dad died, I actually feel like this place is mine. Not something I'm desperately trying not to lose, but something I actually get to build and grow and be proud of." "Your dad would be proud of you regardless, boss. But yeah, this version of you, the one who fought and won, I think this is exactly the person he always knew you'd become." Jack continued his Wednesday visits long after the danger had passed, though the coffee sessions took on an entirely different character. Now relaxed, unhurried conversations rather than quiet, watchful surveillance. He never fully explained the extent of his history with the network he'd assembled, never detailed exactly what decades of writing with the Hells Angels had actually involved, and Emma eventually stopped pressing for those answers, understanding that some things mattered less than who a person had chosen to become, regardless of where they'd started. Frank and Rosa stayed connected too, occasionally stopping by when their travels brought them through Montana, always welcomed with the same warmth Emma extended to family, because in every meaningful sense, that was exactly what they'd become. Sam eventually retired fully from his consulting work with the fraud division, spending more time in Miller's Creek than his home in Wyoming, developing what Emma suspected was becoming a rather serious relationship with Mrs. Patterson's niece. A development that provided the entire shop with months of gentle, affectionate teasing. 6 months after Victor Hale's sentencing, Emma organized a small gathering at the shop, inviting everyone who had shown up during those terrifying weeks, everyone who had driven hundreds of miles based on nothing more than a phone call and a decades-old debt of honor. Nearly 30 people crowded into the space that had once been destroyed, now fully restored and thriving, sharing food and stories long into the evening. Emma stood near the entrance at one point, watching the gathering with something like wonder, watching strangers who had become family laughing together in the same building where 3 violent men had once tried to break her spirit entirely. Jack found her there, standing quietly beside her, as he so often did. "Thank you," Emma said simply, unable to find bigger words for the enormity of what she felt. "For all of it, for remembering a debt most people would have let go decades ago. For believing my father's kindness deserved to be repaid even after he was gone." Jack considered her words for a long moment, his weathered eyes taking in the celebration surrounding them, the shop full of warmth and laughter, where once there had only been fear and destruction. "I didn't save this place, Emma," Jack said quietly. "I want you to understand that clearly. Your father spent 31 years earning the kind of respect and loyalty that brought all these people here tonight. I just made a few phone calls. I simply reminded people not to forget what your father meant to them. What kindness like his deserves in return when the moment finally comes. That's not nothing, Jack. No, he agreed, a small smile crossing his weathered face. I suppose it isn't. The following spring brought its own quiet validation business at Carter's Auto Steady, and thriving the 11 other victims of Victor Hale's schemes largely rebuilt, or in the process of rebuilding, several of them having formed genuine friendships with Emma through shared experience that neither of them had expected, but both deeply valued. Carol's Bakery, fully reopened, sent Emma a box of pastries every month without fail, a small, sweet reminder of connections forged through shared survival. Emma finally finished restoring her father's old Ford pickup, the one that had sat half-completed in the back bay since the day he died, unable to bring herself to touch it during those difficult years of grief and financial struggle. She worked on it during quiet evenings, methodically, carefully finding something deeply healing in finally completing the project her father had left unfinished. The morning she finally started that engine successfully, hearing it rumble to life for the first time in years, Emma sat behind the wheel for a long while, tears streaming freely down her face, though these tears carried none of the desperate grief of years past. These were different tears entirely. Tears of completion, of healing, of a daughter finally honoring her father's memory, not through desperate survival, but through genuine hard-won thriving. She drove that truck slowly through Miller's Creek later that afternoon, waving at familiar faces along Main Street, stopping briefly at the diner, where the collection jar that had once gathered spare change for her struggling shop now sat empty, retired, no longer needed, because the business it once supported had grown strong enough to stand entirely on its own. Jack was waiting out of the shop when she returned, sitting in his usual chair with his usual cup of coffee, watching her pull into the lot with obvious approval. "Run's beautiful," he said as she climbed out of the truck. "Took me long enough to finish it." Some things take exactly as long as they need to take, Emma. No sense rushing what deserves to be done properly. He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his weathered features. "You look happy. Genuinely happy, not just relieved that the worst is finally over." Emma considered that observation, surprised to realize how completely true it was. "I am happy, Jack. For the first time since my parents died, I actually feel like I'm not just surviving anymore. I feel like I'm actually living the life my father would have wanted for me. That's all he ever wanted, Emma. Just that. Nothing more complicated than that." Emma sat down beside him, accepting the second cup of coffee he'd already poured for her, exactly as he'd done every single Wednesday since that terrifying first week, when everything in her life had seemed on the verge of complete collapse. The shop hummed with quiet, ordinary activity around them. Danny working on a customer's transmission. Rose's replacement, a young mechanic Emma had hired 6 weeks earlier, learning the trade with the same careful dedication Emma herself had once shown as a child, sweeping floors for her father. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said, watching steam rise from her coffee cup. "Always. Do you think my dad knew all those years ago, fixing your truck in the middle of the night for a stranger who couldn't pay him back? Do you think some part of him knew that kindness would eventually come back around exactly when I needed it most?" Jack considered the question seriously, the same thoughtful patience he brought to everything, before finally shaking his head slowly. "No, I don't think he knew, Emma. I think your father simply believed that decency mattered regardless of whether it ever got repaid. That's what made him different from most people. He never helped anyone expecting anything in return. He just believed it was the right thing to do, and he trusted that living that way consistently over decades eventually built something more valuable than any single transaction ever could." "And it did," Emma said quietly, looking around at the thriving shops surrounding them, at the community that had rallied so fiercely to protect what her father built. "It built exactly this." Jack nodded slowly, raising his coffee cup slightly in something like a quiet toast. "That it did, Emma. That it certainly did." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, watching the ordinary rhythm of a Wednesday afternoon unfold around them. Customers coming and going, tools clanking against metal, laughter drifting occasionally from the back bay, where Danny was teaching the new mechanic some technique Emma's father had once taught her at exactly that same age. Later that evening, long after Jack had gone home and the shop had closed for the night, Emma stood alone in the empty building, running her hand along the workbench, where her father had spent 3 decades building something that outlasted every attempt to destroy it. She thought about Victor Hale, sitting now in a prison cell, hundreds of miles away, having lost everything he'd spent years accumulating through cruelty and manipulation. She thought about the 11 other victims, slowly rebuilding their own lives with the same fierce determination she herself had discovered within herself during those terrifying weeks. She thought about Jack and Frank and Rosa and Sam and Denise and dozens of strangers who had become family through nothing more than a decades-old promise never forgotten. She locked the shop's front door and climbed the stairs to her apartment, and just before drifting off to sleep that night, she heard the distant, familiar rumble of motorcycles passing along the highway outside a sound that had once filled her with dread during those darkest weeks of the crisis, a sound that now finally meant something entirely different. It meant protection. It meant loyalty. It meant that somewhere out there in small towns scattered across the American West, ordinary people still believed that a debt of kindness, once given freely, deserved to be honored decades later, no matter the cost, no matter how impossible the odds seemed at the beginning. Carter's auto and diesel repair stood exactly where it always had, unbroken and thriving, a testament to one man's 31 years of quiet decency and one daughter's refusal to let that legacy be destroyed by greed. And somewhere out on that dark Montana highway, dozens of engines rumbled steadily onward, carrying forward a code that had outlasted every attempt to break it, proving once and for all that in America, some things truly can never be bought. No matter how much money a desperate man is willing to offer, and no matter how far he is willing to go to try.